the word emergent is the part of it that I liked most was that its use in forestry, where it's the emergent growth, or in agriculture, it's the pre-emergent growth. It's the growth that's just down right at the surface and it's just broken through and it's small. So we said what we are is like this small little thing that's just broken through. But down the road, this very well could this growth will grow up and will become the treetops.
Churches are always looking for novel approaches to bring young people into the fold. But a brand new breed of church is pushing the envelope in a whole new way.
The Emergent Church, a loosely connected group of Christian churches rebelling against the cultural war going on in this country when it comes to religion.
It's a confession that while I'm a Christian, church planting, Jesus loving, evangelizing kind of Christian, I have a problem, one that's only gotten worse, frankly, in my years of being a Christian. And that is that I just don't believe in Christianity anymore. So the emerging church, to me, seems to be the implication or the play out or the ramifications of emergence happening inside the church.
But one of the movement's leaders says, together as a whole, this new generation of churches has the power to change the way Christianity is practiced.
I look at us as an R&D department of people who are trying to innovate and experiment, make a lot of mistakes, I'm sure, but hopefully we'll discover things that can serve the church at large and be of use to the church at large.
Solomon's Porch is an emerging church that began 6 years ago in Minneapolis. Its pastor, Doug Paget, was one of the early emergent leaders. The church meets in the round and has couches and recliners instead of pews.
The setting resembles a coffee house more than a church.
Take one. I don't know if you've seen one of these Jesus bobbleheads, but Jesus is becoming pretty popular out there in our culture and world, kind of as an icon today.
Notions and ideas of this grand emergence that's happening in culture, that there's a great cultural shift that's going on, probably developing over the last 500 years, that kind of shift has ramifications in ecclesiological structures, or what would churches look like.
The emerging church is a place of conversation and dialogue and movement. Where that's going to go, we don't know. We're figuring this out together. We don't have an agenda of what it looks like at the end of the road. We just want to gather up people on this road who want to go together on it.
He's coming at it from a different angle, and I think that's revolutionary.
My name is Rob Bell. I'm a pastor in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not that far away from you.
Some have called it a conversation. These are people who are wrestling with what, if it's a tag that refers to those who are serious about what I would argue is central to the Christian faith, which is the endless, hard questioning of what does it mean to be the people of Jesus.
But now we're in the point where there's too many people in too many places that are fully engaging in this, that no one organization could capture all of it.
I was asked my perspective on what are the real roots of the emerging church. Well, there's several roots. There's a whole root system, and there's many tap roots.
The emerging church movement has triggered much excitement and controversy because of its growing popularity and influence in Christianity. Who are the leaders, and what are they teaching? Because diversity characterizes the emergent church movement, it is difficult to paint all of its leaders with a broad brush.
Well, the emergent church movement today has really changed actually in the last several years, because there's been a lot of changes going on. Matter of fact, the word emergent is not being used as much as it used to be. And so we have to kind of define our terms.
Some have observed that defining the emergent church is like nailing Jell-O to a wall.
Many people have struggled to define the emerging church. A lot of people have defined it as, or have explained it as being like nailing Jell-O to a wall. This is because the emergent church is a lot of moving pieces. They're constantly redefining themselves.
They're very hard to pin down on a doctrine. In fact, that's part of what they pride themselves in, is mushiness and undefinability.
Emergent leaders say because the spectrum of their beliefs is so diverse, it's impossible to make sweeping judgments. Tony Jones, Emergent's new national coordinator, is not concerned by charges of theological sloppiness.
Is it more sloppy than what a systematic theology professor does, sitting in his tenured chair typing up a book on the doctrine of the atonement? Yeah. It's messier than that, but that's, I think, theology as it works itself out in the lives of human beings who are kind of scratching and clawing their way to try to follow Jesus on a daily basis. It's a messy endeavor, and I embrace that messiness.
It is a movement that crosses a number of theological boundaries. Proponents of the emergent church emphasize its developing nature, vast range of beliefs, and its commitment to conversation.
I have a friend who suggests that rather than calling it the emerging church, we ought to call it the church emerging. I think it's good because the people who are involved in this conversation, the people who are involved in what people refer to as this movement, come from a wide background, Protestants and Catholics. And in the Protestant field, it involves people who are Methodist and Presbyterian and Mennonite, a whole stream of Anabaptists, a whole stream of Reformers, people that come from contemporary churches and traditional churches. It's not one little sliver of people. It seems to be people coming out of a whole variety of backgrounds who are having a common conversation about the goodness of the gospel in our world and what that can mean in our world.
The emerging church movement began several years ago as a conversation among evangelical Gen X leaders who were alarmed at church dropout rates among 20s and 30s. About the same time, a pastor from Maryland, Brian McLaren, began writing about what he saw as a growing disillusionment with the way evangelical Christianity was being practiced.
All participants agree on their disillusionment with the institutional church, but do not all agree on where the church is destined to go from here.
A group of individuals who were really kind of frustrated with what they were seeing in the church, with the hypocrisy, with the religiosity of a lot of the present church.
They share a common concern with many evangelicals over the state of the modern church, especially the mega-church phenomenon and seeker-friendly churches.
With my emergent friends, emergent pastors that I know, and we've had debates and disagreements obviously over the years, there's one thing we do agree on, and that is the church does need to change.
For this reason, many evangelicals who observe the emerging church are fascinated by it, drawn to its creative approaches to worship, genuineness of many of the leaders, and the desire to reach Generation X.
Kind of the emerging church, which is a sort of a catch-all phrase for those younger churches and pastors that are trying to figure out how to do church in a postmodern world.
So I like to distinguish between the emergent movement and the emerging movement.
Emergent liberals, the lane that I was somewhat connected to and left. And I would say my problem with this team is not that they're trying to find innovative ways to do church, but they're also calling into question many Christian doctrines that should not be questioned, particularly by those who claim to be pastors. So to include Brian McLaren, Doug Paget, and Rob Bell, who also has a church called Mars Hill, no way affiliated with us.
The emerging movement, that's emergent movement, the emerging movement would, in many cases, like Driscoll, for example, believe in strong doctrinal core. And they would teach the gospel, they would believe in the fundamentals of the faith.
These are people who believe all of the evangelical distinctives and are trying to find a way to make the church more relevant, accessible, culturally connected.
But they are willing to change certain methodologies in order to reach the postmodern young person. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not so good, but that's the emerging movement. My bigger concern is the emergent movement.
Some people say emerging is one thing, emergent is something else. It doesn't matter. They're all the same. And when we were at that conference with their 250 leaders, they alternately called their movement emerging, emergent. They use it synonymously.
Call it what you want, the emerging church is having a big impact across denominational lines. But there are no easy labels. Participants have called themselves postmodern, post-conservative, post-liberal, post-evangelical, and post-Protestant.
Brian McLaren is the closest thing to a spokesperson for the movement. He recently appeared in Time magazine's list of the 25 most influential evangelicals.
A few years ago, when Time magazine decided to include me in its list of the top 25 evangelicals, a lot of evangelicals were very sure this was a mistake. First, that I would be included in the term evangelical at all, and second, that I would be considered influential in any way. But I think my inclusion was an attempt to redress the problem that we're talking about today, the need to break media stereotypes that equate religious with conservative. I do come from an evangelical background, and perhaps of all backgrounds, it is the most deserving of being associated with a conservative stereotype. But I am an example of a growing shift from the monopoly of the religious right on a conservative ethos. And in fact, I think I'm an example that monologue and domination by the religious right is actually becoming a fact of history rather than contemporary news.
There's a character, his name's Rob Bell, and he's very popular in evangelical Christianity right now, mainly because of his Pneuma videos. So he's gained a lot of credibility within the evangelical circles because a lot of pastors use them and show these videos. They're about 10 minutes long. A lot of youth pastors use them. So his name has gained a great deal of credibility. And he has about a 10,000 person church near Grand Rapids.
Bell he's insidious. He's probably the best communicator they have in the entire Emergent movement. He's brilliant. He's articulate. He's interesting. He can communicate. And he just draws these people in.
Be careful. Be careful of people who grab a line from an interview with me and wave that one line around. What about this? He said this. People can write anything they want, and they can be as unbelievably hurtful because the internet is a safe, anonymous place for cowards.
Some religious historians believe the emerging churches represent the next wave of evangelical worship after the boom in megachurches in the 1980s and 1990s.
In all honesty, I think most of those in the emergent movement, whether it's Bell or McLaren or Tony Jones, are probably really nice people. I believe they're sincere. I have friends in the movement that are sincere. So my intention in addressing these things is to expose, not personally attack them, but to expose the things that they are believing and the things that they are teaching. And the reason that I have such a passion and I'm zealous for this is because eternity is at stake.
So they have candles and couches. What do we care? No, they're brainwashing your kids into believing a worldview that's not a Christian worldview. It's a pagan worldview.
If this can happen at my old church, Johnson's Ferry Baptist Church, now called Johnson's Ferry, but Bryant Wright, my old pastor, has been the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest denomination other than Catholic, largest Protestant denomination in the United States. It can happen to any church, anywhere.
At the heart of the emerging Reformation is a perception of major changes in contemporary culture. Most emerging pleas for reformation in Christendom are rooted in their understandings of postmodernism. Those within the movement generally believe that the modern church cannot connect with the postmodern mind and culture, so the emerging church conversation responds to the perceived influence of modernism in Western Christianity.
When we talk about the emergent church, we're talking about a group of people who are trying to meld syncretistically postmodern thought with Christianity.
Stan Grenz writes, "We ought to commend the postmodern questioning of the Enlightenment assumption that knowledge is objective and hence dispassionate." Brian McLaren states, "Arguments that pit absolutism versus relativism and objectivism versus subjectivism prove meanemless or absurd to postmodern people."
Just a few years ago, I was asked if I would write an emergent book, and why. And I remember even my answer back was, do you know who you're asking that question to? In other words, it's basically the framework of postmodernism. But the publishing industry has seen the success of these books. I mean, it's massively successful. The best-selling books in Christianity today would be termed by myself as emergent. Some of them are now not wanting that term, but they still are.